Okay, Genesis 31, finishing off Genesis 31 this morning. Finally leaving behind the Laban saga, we could call it. So Genesis chapter 31, and we'll be looking at verses 43 through the end of the chapter. Genesis 31, 43 through 55. All right. Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day for my daughters or for their children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jagar Sahadutha, but Jacob called it Galid. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me today. Therefore he named it Galid and Mizpah, where he said, the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. Then Laban said to Jacob, see this heap and the pillar which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and this pillar to me to do harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. And Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country and called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread and spent the night in the hill country. Early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home. All right, so reminding ourselves of the context here. Obviously, Laban has chased Jacob and the family once he discovered that he was gone and the family gods were stolen, and we dealt with that whole narrative yesterday. But then after not finding the gods because of Rachel's deception, nevertheless, he couldn't find them, and so he had no fault to lay at Jacob's feet. And Jacob then uses that opportunity to lay out a list of grievances, really 20 years worth of grievances before Laban. And that's the immediate context here, and Jacob's affirmation in verse 42 that if the God of his father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, we see that language again in this passage, had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. So that's sort of the final exclamation point charge against Laban. But then he says, God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. So that's the context. And in that context, then, Laban begins his dialogue here in verse 43, leading to this whole covenant between Laban and Jacob, between the family of Laban and the family of Jacob. So the first question I want to spend a moment on here is what do you think Laban's motivation is here at this point? Considering all the context of the 20 years and then the confrontation and then this final accusation by Jacob, what is motivating Laban now in these opening verses and leading him towards the desire to have this covenant with Jacob? What do you think?
Doesn't want Jacob to come take everything.
Okay, so he's maybe a little fearful, right? He still doesn't know where the gods are. Maybe one of the wives has taken them. We talked last week about how in this ancient culture, the gods were tied to the inheritance. But he also recognizes the hand of Yahweh upon Jacob. He said that, several passages ago when Jacob is ready to leave and Laban acknowledges, he tries to attribute it to divination, but he acknowledges that Yahweh had been good to him through Jacob. So he recognizes that Jacob seems to have a whole lot of luck, probably in his eyes. So he's probably a little bit fearful about his own stability and future. And he's just been charged. All of his bad deeds for 20 years have just been laid out. And remember who is standing there as sort of witnesses between Jacob and Laban at this point. Well, his daughters for sure. Who else? God. Yes, remember Laban gathered all of his kinsmen, we read in the previous text, and took them with him to pursue Jacob. So these are probably his sons, but probably also other family members. In fact, if you remember in last week's text, when Jacob is laying out these accusations, and I think it actually occurs when Jacob is responding to Laban's accusation, Jacob says, let these kinsmen judge between you and me. So this is sort of a courtroom scene, and Laban's own family members are standing there watching this. And you have to remember in this sort of culture, there sometimes gets to be tension within families and even battling over who's going to be the patriarch, who's going to be the primary leader of the clan. And so there may have been even that a little bit. Here Laban doesn't look very good. Perhaps his clansmen, his kinsmen, don't know that he changed Jacob's labor wages 10 times. They perhaps don't know about all of the tricky, sticky things that happened that Laban was being accused of here. And so now he's put in a bit of a bad light, a bad position. And so he begins very aggressively here. I mean, it's almost offensive. I mean, look at how he starts in verse 43. The daughters are my daughters, and the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. He starts very aggressive, almost trying to portray himself as the superior party in this dispute. But he very quickly recognizes at the end of that verse, basically he says, but what can I do? Right? So he's almost, you can see, and this happens throughout this text, Laban is a very unsettled man. He doesn't have a lot of ground to stand on. He's trying to assert himself. He's trying to put himself in a strong position in this dispute, but he really doesn't have a lot of ground to do that. So he kind of goes back and forth. He sort of asserts himself. I mean, you can imagine this. We all know people like this, right? Who can sort of puff out their chests and, but then they kind of, cower back a little bit when they recognize they don't exactly have the ground to stand on. That's really what we feel in this text, is this sort of back and forth assertiveness, and then a recognition that he's not standing on good ground, but he's trying to be in the strong position. Ed.
Never admit he's guilty.
Right.
Just he'll concede, make peace of some sort, but he'll never say I was guilty.
Right. So he never admits wrong. He's trying to assert himself in a strong position, but who is the one who actually proposes the idea of a covenant? Laban does, because he's afraid, right? So he's proposing a covenant, but he doesn't want to appear weak. So he asserts himself, everything that's here is mine. So let's make a covenant, so this is good for you. This is good for you. Again, you can sort of see a used car salesman sort of, I just picture Laban as this slimy, slick kind of individual, clearly by all that he's done. So he places himself or he desires a treaty. And think about this is going to become important for one of the main points I want to make from this text. Jacob doesn't have to agree to this treaty. He doesn't have to agree to this covenant. He's in a pretty strong position at this point. He's close to the promised land now. Gilead is just on the other side of the Jordan from the promised land. He's miles and miles away from Laban's land now. So he's in the stronger position. And he also, by this time, is fully assured of God's faithfulness to his promises, right? God had made promises to him at Bethel. He saw those promises answered the minute he got to Laban's land with the shepherds and seeing Rachel there and all of that. And then, of course, 20 years, he recognized, he just said it to Laban, 20 years of hardship, 20 years of deception, and yet God was clearly with him. God clearly gave him wealth. God is the one, remember, who told him to leave. So he's got confidence in that. And he's going to exhibit even more of that confidence here in this text. So he's in a very strong position. He doesn't have to do this treaty. He doesn't have to do this covenant. And yet, it's interesting that Jacob does then take the initiative and really is the one who sets up all of the condition, or not the conditions, but the pillar and the heap, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then later the sacrifice and all of the necessary elements of the covenant. Jacob takes the initiative there. But it's initially Laban, and you can even see a little bit of his uncertainty in verse 44. Come, let us make a covenant, you and I. And notice this phrase, let it be a witness between you and me. There's an interesting phrase here, because in the translation, it reads as if what does it sound like is a witness between you and me in that verse 44. What is a witness between them? What's that? The covenant, right? There's the translation here has a neuter pronoun, it. And so the assumption there is that the antecedent to the pronoun, what is the it? Well, it's the covenant. The covenant will be a witness between you and me. However, the word for covenant is a feminine noun, and the verb for to be, the covenant will be, is a masculine verb. And we don't understand this in English, right? Because we don't have feminine and masculine nouns and verbs, right? But in many, many languages, in fact, probably most languages, the noun, the gender of the noun has to match the gender of the verb, and that helps with communication. Well, in this case, if covenant is the witness, it doesn't match the gender of the be verb, which is masculine. So what some scholars will argue with that, some scholars, there's maybe a grammatical way you can make it work where covenant is the witness. But a lot of scholars say that Laban's point here is, and we see this explicitly in the text in a moment, that God will be the witness between them, because it's a masculine verb, and so there's sort of an understood referent. Who will be the witness? Well, actually, God will be the witness. He's actually calling upon or invoking Jacob's God as the witness of this covenant, which also indicates a little bit of weakness and fear. It's almost as if he's saying, now, Jacob, now listen, your God will be the witness between us. And because he's afraid that Jacob's going to use some of this to his advantage, that his stability is shaky. And so he wants this covenant in order to protect himself ultimately, which doesn't surprise us. He's always been concerned for himself only. But he wants this covenant so that Jacob, who he knows is a religious man, Jacob has just attributed all of his wealth to his God. Now Laban's like, okay, well, let's make your God the witness between us to make sure that there's no further tension here. So he's very motivated to keep himself safe. And so they engage in, the rest of this text is a covenant ceremony. It's a covenant between Laban and Jacob. And, we've seen the significance and importance of covenants already throughout the Old Testament, right? Covenants were common in the ancient Near Eastern culture. Many scholars will point out that even the covenants that God makes with his people, the covenant with Noah, the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in their structure and in their elements are very similar to other ancient Near Eastern cultures. The pagans would have practiced this, would have been very familiar with this. So this is not unusual for Laban to initiate a covenant. But we need to recognize the significance of what this is. You didn't enter a covenant lightly. He would have seen this as a significant treaty by which there would be able to maintain peace between these two tense families, these two tense factions, and that will become important here in a few moments as well. But Jacob in particular, Laban is the one who initiates this, but Jacob has a special understanding of covenants. In fact, he has a covenant with whom? With God, with Yahweh himself, right? He knows of the situations involved with the covenant made with Abraham, his grandfather, with Isaac, and then that covenant has been officially passed on to him, not only through the blessing that was given by Isaac, first through trickery and then confirmed even after Isaac knew that he'd been tricked. But God himself had met Jacob at Bethel and had confirmed the covenant. I will be with you. I will bring you back to the land. And so he recognizes, even maybe with more depth than Laban, the significance of covenants, and in particular, the significance of covenants between man and God. And even again, Laban recognizes that Jacob is a religious man, that he has confirmed allegiance to Yahweh, such that Laban not only sort of maybe in a understood way invokes God there in verse 44, but he explicitly is going to invoke Yahweh in verse 49. He says, we'll talk more about this in a moment, but the Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Yahweh, watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. So Laban recognizes that Jacob is deeply religious and committed to Yahweh, and Jacob approaches this entire covenant arrangement with that in light. This is not just a typical ancient Near Eastern covenant ceremony. Jacob then doesn't say a word. He doesn't really speak in the rest of this text. He does swear by the fear of his father later, so I mean we know he does speak, but he just begins to take action. Laban proposes the covenant, and then in verse 45, Jacob immediately agrees and takes the initiative. And what is the first thing that he does? He sets up a pillar of stones. Now, what does that sound like? Is that familiar? Has he done this before? Yep, he did it at altar, and we talked about the fact that this is essentially an altar. This is a symbol of Jacob's allegiance to Yahweh. And we're going to see he's going to offer a sacrifice on it at the end of this ceremony. We'll see the significance of that in a moment. But this particular pillar, it seems to be very intentional that Jacob is doing something in parallel with what happened at Bethel. These are literal pillars at the beginning of the Laban conflict and at the end of the Laban conflict. So he is, in a sense, signaling that here for himself. The setting up of this pillar is likely something for him individually. He's doing something as an individual first. He's about to set up something else that will be more representative of the relationship between him and Laban. But this pillar, he starts with what represents his relationship with God. And that sets the whole tenor for this covenant arrangement. This is not just a covenant between Jacob and Laban. This is a covenant between Jacob and God and Jacob and Laban. It's almost as if Jacob's saying, okay, you want to do this, and you have even invoked the name of my God here, then we're going to do this right. And I'm going to start by declaring my allegiance to Yahweh, by building, remember what an altar signifies. An altar is a mini mountain. It's a mini representation of the stairway to heaven. Remember the ziggurat to heaven, the way in which we approach God. And so he is signaling his individual allegiance, similar to Bethel, between himself and God. But then in verse 46, after that individual allegiance and setting up this altar, which will be significant in a few moments, in verse 46, he calls his kinsmen. And, you know, at first reading, you might think his kinsmen, well, who is with him? Well, he's only got his sons, and maybe he has some servants, but those aren't kinsmen, and his sons are probably teenagers. So it's probably likely that kinsmen includes Laban and the other kinsmen that are there, like the larger kinsmen, meaning his uncle and his family members on his mother's side. So he calls them together and he tells them to build a heap of stones. And this is clearly differentiated from the altar, from the pillar. In fact, unbelieving atheistic scholars point to this and they say, see, this is just two different textual traditions, one which said pillar and one which said heap, and then someone later sloppily put them together, and this proves that the Bible isn't true. Well, no, this is intentional. This actually happened this way. It is true, this is the only time we ever see something like this, where two sort of piles of stone are erected. But what's important, why that happened, is because Jacob recognizes he's in an unusual situation. He has a relationship with God, and he wants to picture that through the altar, but Laban does not have any relationship with Yahweh. So this altar to Yahweh is not going to suffice to represent the covenant between him and Laban. He needs another monument that will symbolize the horizontal covenant. Later, when two of God's people make a covenant together, well, they're making a covenant together and they also have a covenant with God. And so it's easy to represent that. I mean, in our day and age, the marriage covenant between two believers is like that, right? It's a covenant not just horizontal, but it's also vertical, but it's all unified because you've got two people in covenant relationship with God who are now also making a covenant with one another. That's not what's going on here. And that becomes more and more clear as we work our way through the text. This is an unbelieving pagan man. He's a family member, but one of the things we see happening in this text is sort of an official separation between these two clans. And so Jacob has to find a way to signify both his covenant relationship with Yahweh and his covenant relationship with Laban. And they're really separate things. They're separate, they're unified in him, the individual, but he can't use the altar to Yahweh to symbolize the covenant relationship that he is making with Laban. So he sets up a separate pillar, a heap, which is a symbol of their joint allegiance to the covenant. John Currid, an Old Testament scholar, says this heap and pillar both serve as a physical witness to the compact. The ceremony thus involves a double sign, and that's significant. We're going to see a lot of doubles in this text, certainly for the purpose of intensification. So we find there in 46, after they build this heap, what do they do immediately after that? End of verse 46. They ate. Okay, so were they just tired and hungry? It was time to eat, and so they had a potluck, or what's going on here? Is there a significance to eating? It could be the preposition here is a little bit unclear. It may be that they ate on the heap of stones, or as our translation says, next to the heap of stones. So there's a definite connection between the meal and the heap of stones. What's significant about a meal in covenant making? Any ideas? What is it? What are you signifying? We don't really view it this way in our culture, but we kind of do. What are you signifying when you sit down and you eat with someone? What's that?
He,
What's the first one?
One among them.
One among them? Yeah. Sort of a peace between the parties, right? You don't eat with your enemies, right? And even today, we don't eat with people that we hate, right? But in the ancient Near Eastern culture, it was even more significant. You did not eat with your enemies. You ate with those with whom you had peace established. And so it is very common, and we'll talk even more about this because they do it again at the end, in a covenant ceremony for a significant symbol of the peace between the parties to actually eat with one another. And that's what's being signified here. They erect this pillar, which is a sign of this covenant that is being made between Laban and Jacob. And the first thing they do is they eat as a sign of the relationship between them, that is the peace that is being established through this covenant. Now, what's very interesting, it's sort of a humorous couple of verses here, is when they name the heap. And they sort of have a battle of names. And good thing they went with Gilead, because it's a lot easier to say than Jegar Saha Dutha. But you'll see there, if you have footnotes, both of these words mean the same thing. But one is Aramaic, a heap of witness, and Gilead is Hebrew, that means a heap of witness. So it's again sort of humorous. Jacob, Laban has proposed the covenant for selfish reasons. Jacob takes the initiative. He builds this altar, and then he tells them to gather the rocks to build this heap, and they eat. And then Laban tries to assert himself in a strong position again. Okay, I'm going to name it. And he names it Heap of Witnesses, which is a good name. That's what it is, right? And then Jacob comes alongside and says, no, it's Gilead. And he uses Hebrew. Now, why would he have done that? Why would he have given it basically the same name, but just in his language rather than Laban's language? What's he doing there? What do you think?
He's asserting that he's the one making the covenant.
He's reasserting himself in the strong position. And that's signified not only with the fact that he's using his language, but remember, what region are they in? What it's called, what is it called? Do you remember? Laban pursues Jacob, and they're in the region of what? Look at verse 25. They pitched their tents in the hill country of Gilead. There's actually a word play here between Gilead, which means heap of witness, and Gilead. And it's almost as if Jacob is not only asserting himself in a stronger position by virtue of language, but he's also sort of reminding Laban of where they are. We're closer to my homeland than your homeland. And we're going to call this heap by the Hebrew name, which sounds very similar to this land in which we are. He's asserting himself over Laban in this covenant relationship. And Laban, again, we find this puff up and then this kind of back down. He sort of acquiesces. He calls it Gilead, but then he has to sort of stick in another name. Okay, I'll call it Gilead, but I'm also going to call it Mizpah, right? And Mizpah, if you see there in your footnote, means something like watchtower. And again, it seems like Laban is sort of just reminding Jacob, okay, this is, and he says it explicitly here in a moment. Okay, this is gonna watch you. This is gonna make sure that you keep your side of the covenant, right? This is a watchtower. This is a Mizpah. This is not just a heap of witnesses. This is a watchtower. And remember, Laban is a very superstitious man, right? He thought, he used the divination, he thought, to determine where he got his wealth from. He's all concerned about his household gods. It may be by naming it Mizpah, he's indicating that he sort of sees this as sort of a magical, ward, that if Jacob ever comes near here to come over and do me harm, well, then this watchtower is gonna sort of ward him off. He's, again, trying to assert himself, but then evidencing a little bit of fear in what's going on here. And so he says it explicitly in verse 49. He names it Gilead and Mizpah, for he said, and notice this phrase here, the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. And there is his explicit now evoking the name of Yahweh. Now, this is an interesting verse, or an interesting statement that Laban makes. The Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. I'm just curious, have any of you ever heard anybody quote that verse? It's apparently often quoted or used in like Christian hitch, or things that you buy, little plaques or even necklaces. They'll quote this verse as like, oh, isn't this a sweet sentiment? The Lord watched between you and me while we are parted, or whatever the language here is. I actually looked it up, and you can find like lockets that have this on there. So like best friends will put this on a locket, and then when we meet again, the Lord watched over you and me. And I saw it on plaques and t-shirts. I even found, I just Googled it, a pastor who was like retiring and leaving his church, and he used this verse. The Lord watched between you and me. What's exactly the language? When we are out of one another's sight. What's the problem with using that verse as sort of a sweet sentiment between friends?
Not the context.
That's not what he's saying. It's a threat, right? So I'm a pastor and I'm leaving. Lord, watch between you and me when we are out. Don't do anything to harm me, And that's essentially what he was saying. Right? This is the context. This is a threat. Like the Lord, your God's going to be watching you. We use that language sometimes. Your God is watching. Don't do anything, bad. This is going to separate us. This is conflict. Laban seems very, very fidgety here. He's very, very concerned. And what this really indicates, and we're going to come back to this. This is the formal separation between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the former ancestors. There's never any connection between the two again. Right? Abraham sent the servant back to the homeland to get away for Isaac. And then Rebekah sends Jacob, go back to the homeland to get a wife. So they've gone back several times. It's like, this is where there's this continual connection. But by now we're seeing that the clan of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are becoming a distinct clan from their ancestors. We already saw that in some of the language that was used previously, even how Jacob refers to going back to my homeland and that sort of thing, my kinsmen. Well, you're with your kinsmen. Remember we talked about that? This now is the formal separation that is rooted in conflict. And we see that conflict continue with, syrupy, slick Laban. When the covenant stipulations are laid out, he begins them in verse 50. And again, just listen to the irony of this charge. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is a witness between you and me. Now, why is that just a preposterous thing for him to say? Has Jacob ever oppressed his wives? Who has oppressed his daughters? He has. Whose fault is it that Jacob has 4 wives? I mean, again, we put some blame at Jacob's feet, but it's Laban's fault. I mean, it was very common in ancient Near Eastern marriage treaties to have this kind of language. Yeah, I'll give you my daughter, but you don't marry anyone else. I mean, that was common. But it's Laban's fault that he even has the 4 wives that he has. So this is beginning a set of sort of preposterous covenant stipulations. Jacob has never oppressed his wives. Laban is again asserting himself to sort of save face. The truth is that Jacob's wives and children are now going to be much safer and much better cared for with Jacob than they had ever been with Laban. But this continues in a moment. But first, notice again how Laban invokes God's name. He says, although no one is with us, see, God is witness, right? So there are other men there. And typically in a covenant, you would establish the witnesses of the covenant. But even Laban, again, because he's so superstitious, he's so afraid, and he recognizes Jacob's devotion to Yahweh, he says, God is going to be the witness here. So he's really setting himself up. Don't do anything against what we're doing here, because your God is gonna punish you if you do. And so what we find then in verses 51 through the end of the chapter is the sort of formal covenant ceremony. And this is where Laban sort of, asserts himself again. Verse 51, Laban said to Jacob, see, this heap and this pillar, which I have set between you and me. Well, is he the one who actually did that? No, I mean, he's again trying to assert himself. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and this pillar to me to do harm. This is very much language of solemn covenant oath that we have here. In fact, in verse 52, there's an untranslated Hebrew word that appears before I and before you. It's the Hebrew word im. And so like in verse 52, this heap is a witness and the pillar is a witness that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and this pillar. It's untranslated, but in Hebrew, that was a word that would signify solemn oath. So this is now the formal covenant oath that is being uttered between Laban and Jacob. And really what he's signifying here is that the pillar and the heap are not only just sort of representative monuments, but they actually serve a function. What function is especially this heap, and then he sort of throws in the pillar too. Yeah, that thing you created over there too. What actual practical function are these going to serve?
Literal boundaries.
Literal boundary markers. Like, you don't pass this boundary. This is not just a monument that they're going to put up in a square that people can remember what happened here. No, this is an actual boundary marker. Again, this is a formal separation. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their family never of their own will go back up to that land. In the far distant future, some of their ancestors are going to be taken up to that land, but it's going to be under bad conditions. The Assyrians are going to come and are going to sweep them away, and that's from that same region. But it never again do they go of their own will. And so this is a solemn oath, but again, it's sort of empty, because is there really any chance that Jacob is going to come back and go back up to Laban's land? Right? He has no reason to. He left of his own will. It's almost, it's almost this kind of thing where Jacob's like, I'm leaving, and Laban's like, yeah, you're leaving. Get out of here. I want to show you that I actually am the one who made you leave. No, he didn't. He clearly didn't. Jacob left in the cover of night. And so again, this is all building up to show a separation that Laban, sees as necessary for them to be able to operate, because neither of them trusts each other. Laban accused Jacob of trickery, which he didn't do. He left in the dead of night, but he had to. And Jacob accused Laban of a lot of trickery, which he was absolutely guilty of. So this covenant is basically saying we need to remain separate because we can't trust each other. And so this is the final break with Abraham's family ancestry. And from this point on, there will always be a permanent border region. This region of Gilead will always be a permanent border region between what will become Israel and what will become Syria. And it's still to this day, this division between the two nations. This is clearly ordained by God. Remember that God is the one who told Jacob to leave, and God is the one who told Laban, don't do anything to harm Jacob. So this is initiated by God, this covenant. And if we look through the rest of the Old Testament, there's continual, perpetual conflict between what will become the nation of Israel and what will become the nation of Syria, Assyria and then Syria. Continual, and that conflict is still going on to this day. Right? I mean, just survey with me for a moment at the number of times this happens. Judges 3:8. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, and the people of Israel served that dude for 8 years. Okay, and it's talking about the king of this very land. So even God uses this tension to punish Israel. 2 Samuel 8, and when the Syrians of Damascus, so now by that time, David's time, they become a nation. When the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobath, when they come down and threaten Israel, David struck down 22,000 men of the Syrians and put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. The Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. So by David's time, the conflict is still there, and God gives David superiority over the Syrians to the degree that they're paying him tribute. 1 Kings chapter 20. Then Hadad, king of Syria, gathers his army together. 32 kings were with him, and horses and chariots, and he went up and closed in on Samaria and fought against it. So we see this back and forth. David goes up and defeats them. They pay tribute. Later, 1 Kings chapter 20, they came down and fight Samaria. 1 Kings 22, we see the same thing happening again. 2 Kings 5, you'll remember this story. Naaman, who we know from the whole leprosy and dipping in the Jordan River, Naaman was a general in the Syrian army who defeated the Israelites. And then 2 Kings chapter 9, Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram, and they go to war with Hazael, king of Syria. So this is marking the beginning of a long and tumultuous relationship between the ancestors of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the ancestors of Laban and his family. And it's really being marked right here, and it's fueled by, ultimately, Laban's deception and the conflict that is set up between Laban and Jacob. So these are preposterous sort of charges, but Laban is once again trying to assert himself. And look at verse 53, even in sort of the final statement of, here's where you sign on the dotted line for the contract kind of language. He says, the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. And there are some commentators who try to argue that maybe Laban is seeing just one God here, and maybe he's showing allegiance to the God of Jacob to some degree, but he's not, and we know that for a couple of reasons. Number one, the verb judge is plural. So it's clear that he's saying, I want your God and my God both to be judge here of this treaty. It's clear in the grammar, but it's also clear by the fact that Laban is clearly polytheistic. Even later in Joshua chapter 24, Joshua says to the people, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived behind the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, and they served other gods, plural. Right? So we know this. We talked about this all the way back. In fact, I think I quoted this verse when we were in the end of Genesis 11, going into Genesis 12, talking about Terah and talking about Abraham and their family. They were a polytheistic pagan clan. And Laban clearly is still polytheistic. We've seen his false gods, we've seen the divination and all of that. And so he's trying to, again, assert himself by evoking both his God, or at least one of his gods, the god of his, his clan god, Nahor, and the God of Abraham, to plural judge between us, which indicates further separation. This is not just a separation of space or just the conflict. This is a separation that exists because they serve different gods. There really cannot be a religious union between these peoples because they worship different gods. And again, that's signified by Jacob setting up his own altar and then setting up a different pillar to represent the horizontal covenant between them. But then notice what Jacob does. Again, we have this back and forth asserting. Does Jacob say, yeah, I'll swear by the God of my God and your God? Is that what he does? No. What does he do? So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. And again, we see that language, and these are the only two times we ever see God referred in that way. And we saw its significance last week, that this language is evidencing who his true fear is when he had every reason to be fearful in this conflict. And he once again describes it in that way. And remember what this would have done for Israel, the original readers of this text. He didn't take the bait. He didn't swear by this pagan god. He swore by the fear of our God, the fear of the God of his ancestors. Yeah.
So here, clearly, he invokes the fear of Isaac twice. And we
Yeah.
saw it in the earlier text, and we
Mhm.
saw it here. But then Laban says the God of Abraham. Is it because, in his mind, he was thinking Abraham or Abram before there was a covenant where Abram clearly was a syncretist, clearly was
Yeah.
polytheistic, but here we don't see Isaac worshiping. Isaac did not worship multiple gods.
Yes.
And so
Yeah,
he
it
skips
very-
Isaac and goes back to
It
Abraham.
very well could be that was another tactic that Laban is playing.
Like
Abraham has direct ties.
trying to tie Jacob back to his original
Right.
father and Abraham, and Jacob is saying, no, this is the God of Isaac,
Right.
who has separated 100%
Absolutely.
from the history of Abraham
Yep.
before the Yahweh made a covenant.
Exactly. Because Abraham did worship Nahor.
He did.
At one point. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, that's an excellent point and very likely.
Yeah.
Right. Once again, playing a game of assertion, trying to, again, being a superstitious person, he may have been trying to, in a way, sort of trick Jacob into swearing by the wrong God. The God of Abraham. I mean, it's the same God as my God,
Mhm.
and Jacob doesn't take the bait.
Right.
In fact, Calvin makes this explicit. Calvin notes, Jacob did not assent to the preposterous form of oath dictated by his father-in-law, as too many do, who, in order to gain favor of the wicked, pretend to be of the same religion with them. And I think that's significant. That's exactly what's going on here. Jacob could have, and remember, Jacob was sort of a passive guy when he was younger. He was the mama's boy. He was sort of passive, but he's showing a little bit of guts now in this interchange. Every time Laban continues to try to trick him or continues to try to assert himself, Jacob stands up and does what is right before the eyes of Yahweh. This is a changed man. These 20 years have changed Jacob significantly. And so he doesn't take the bait. It would have been easy for him to say, yes, I swear by Nahor. Or I swear by my God and your God. It would have been easy. That would have been the simple thing to do, but he doesn't. He clearly, it's an excellent point that Marquell is making here. He clearly says, no, the God of Isaac. There's some distance placed between that land and now, and swears by him instead. But
You have to wonder, Laban started off to go down and capture them and bring them back. What did God whisper in his ear that so unhinged him
yeah,
that he melted?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, all we have in the text is that God said, don't do anything good or bad, leave him alone, basically. And it scared him. You're right. So he could have said more. We don't always, we're not always given the full text, or that could have been enough. Because by this point, he has acknowledged, he knows, remember, by divination, he knows that all of his wealth came through Jacob because of Yahweh. So he knows this is a powerful God. And this is the essence of what is sometimes referred to as henotheism. Polytheism just means we believe in many gods. Henotheism means they believe in many gods, but there are gods of certain regions. And so, I believe, so he believed that Yahweh existed, but my God of my region is Nahor. And it's almost like they see a battle of the gods, right? And so he's recognizing, even though he's tried to get the upper hand over these 20 years over Jacob, it didn't work. I mean, he did marry Leah off, that worked. And Jacob did get him some wealth, but even with the thing with the spotted and striped sheep and goats and all that, Jacob came out ahead. So he kind of, in the battle of the gods, even in the land of Nahor, typically when you're in a particular land of a god, that god is stronger in his land. Mm-hmm. Well, even in the land of Nahor, Yahweh had the upper hand. Now remember where they are. They're closer, and he talked to him. So he's you're right, he's pretty shaken up. So even he might not have said anything more than leave him alone. But sometimes that's enough. Okay, yeah.
Well, you see this later on when the Assyrians take Samaria. And
yeah,
the Samaritans say, you got to send some of those Jews back because their God. So this idea of
regional gods and battles of gods, yeah.
Particular in this particular these cultures,
yeah,
specifically in this culture.
Yep, exactly. But again, Jacob doesn't believe in other gods, right? He is a monotheist, and that's the difference between henotheism and monotheism is significant. And Israel, the Jewish religion is unique in its monotheism. It's not that other nations didn't have their gods, they did, but yeah, there are other gods too, and my God's better than your God kind of thing. Jacob's like, no, I'm not even going to acknowledge Nahor. I am swearing by the fear of my father. And so Jacob then, again, in a very, because he knows what's going on here, he offers a sacrifice, very likely on his own altar. And it doesn't appear, this is a little bit of speculation, but it doesn't appear that Laban is at all involved in that sacrificial piece. So it seems like Jacob begins the covenant by setting up his own altar, and then he does all the horizontal stuff. And then he ends with a sacrifice before his God, Yahweh. And then we find another sort of final meal together. As he called his kinsmen to eat bread, and they ate bread and spent the night in the hill country. And once again, this reminds us of the significance of a covenant meal. And this continues to be significant for the nation of Israel. At Mount Sinai, in Exodus chapter 24, after God makes a covenant with Moses, the whole Sinai covenant, verse 11, and he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and they ate and drank. That is significant. That signifies now the peace that has been established between God and his people. All of the feasts of Israel, the Passover, and even the peace offering in the sacrificial system where you would sacrifice an animal and then be given some of the meat to eat, all of that signified peace that is covenantally established between God and men. And do we have a similar meal in the new covenant? We do it every week. That's why we do it every week, because this is the meal that signifies the peace that we have with God through the sacrifice of atonement. That's what we're symbolizing every single week in the Lord's Supper. It's not just, oh yeah, I remember what Jesus did. It is that. There's nothing magical that happens, but it is an embodiment. It is the climax of the covenant service in which we are reminding ourselves of the covenant relationship between God and his people. And then Laban is appeased with all of this, and he, bids his family farewell and sends them off. So very quickly, what is the primary point of this whole passage then? What is really the central thing being emphasized and communicated in this covenant ceremony? I mentioned it several times along the way, but I want to put a little exclamation point on it. What's the primary point?
Separation from.
Yes, absolutely. The emphasis here is on the final separation between these two peoples. And that is emphasized by in almost every element of the covenant, there are two features, two stone markers, two names for the markers, two different languages, two place names, two different stipulations. He talks about the marriage and then the boundary, two different meals, two invocations of God by two different names, and two different ancestors. That's emphasized over and over again through this text, which stresses the separation between God's covenant people and pagan people. And this is, of course, true for us today, right? We have a separation between us, the covenant people of God, and the pagan people around us. We have different gods. We have a different homeland. We have different language, right? In a spiritual sense, we have different families. But, and this is important, we'll end with this. Notice though, that even though the whole text is emphasizing the separation, and it's been very tense, does Jacob do this in an antagonistic way in which he's sort of poking Laban in the eye and trying to create trouble? He doesn't. In fact, the whole point of this is to not only emphasize the separation, but to establish as much peace as possible. I mean, Jacob goes out of his way to pursue peace. And we see that even in his disposition. We've seen a lot of contrasts, two languages, two gods, two this and that. But the other contrast we see very clearly in this text is two different dispositions for the whole thing. Laban is aggressive, strutting his stuff. Don't you dare do anything mean to my daughters. Don't you come over my land. And Jacob through the whole thing is just, he does stand up for what he believes, but he's trying to establish peace between him and between Laban. He doesn't compromise. He doesn't weaken his convictions to maintain peace, but he does, and in fact, he had every reason to press his advantage because he had been wronged and demand recompense, but he doesn't. He pursues peace. And this is such an important, beautiful picture for what we are to be. We have to maintain separation from the world. We serve different gods. We cannot pretend that we have the same gods. But that doesn't mean we treat the unbelievers as enemies and we constantly try to go to war with them. No, we try to pursue as much peace as possible, right? In the New Testament, it's commanded of us. Pursue peace as much as we can with unbelievers. There are points at which we can't. And we have the right to stand up for what we believe. And even, like Jacob does, when there's injustice, to say it how it is. You have wronged me. But as much as possible, we should try to maintain peace with unbelieving people. And of course, we even have a stronger motivation than perhaps Jacob did. And that is we want to woo them to the gospel. They actually can come into covenant relationship with our God. I mean, Laban could have, of course, but this is in this age of grace where God's not focused on one ethnic people. We have the new covenant is made with people from every tongue, tribe, and nation. We even have a greater motivation to establish peace, but that should be our disposition. We have a difference. We can't compromise. That's the other cliff, right? You see a lot of Christians who are like, well, we want to establish peace with unbelievers. So we kind of water down the truth. We pretend like we agree with the same. No. We can't compromise. Jacob didn't do that, but he did establish peace. And that should absolutely be our perspective towards the unbelieving people of this world as well. Let's pray. Father, we are grateful for this text. We are thankful for the picture that it gives us of our proper relationship in covenant with you. And we praise you for that through the sacrifice of your Son. We look forward to celebrating that again this morning as we do each week. But also the disposition we ought to have to unbelieving people around us, not compromising, not pretending that we believe the same things, but at the same time, trying to live at peace with all men. And we pray that you would help us to be that kind of people who are faithful to our covenant with you and who are seeking to bring more people into covenant relationship with you through the gospel. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.